Welcome back to GP Tips Reloaded. We're here to bring you a fresh new perspective to one of our earlier tutorials, which is basic posing in photography. Before we get to snapping any actual photos, we gotta make sure our kits don't look like the average display at a big box store. We're gonna start off with the standard factory fresh pose, more commonly known as the neutral stance. You want your feet shoulder width apart, legs turned out ever so slightly at the thigh joint, shoulders squared, maybe a smidge higher than that. Keep the arms symmetrical, turned slightly inwards and very lightly bent at the elbows. And finally, tuck the chin down. There's also a more extreme version of the stance that you'll sometimes see floating around Facebook and Twitter, where it's essentially the same, but with the waist brought out a lot more forward and the chest crunched down. Look at how absolutely stanced this dude is. Yeesh! Moving on to some more dynamic poses, our first tutorial centered on this concept of action and reaction, where every limb out or every movement you want to convey should ideally be balanced in some way. You wouldn't just want the arm stationary, swung out for a shooting pose. You want to balance that out with something like firm footwork, or an arm being raised defensively with a shield out, or swung back priming a grenade. A good example of balancing limbs is with a dashing motion. If you swing this left leg forward and extend the right leg back, but then have the arm on the left reaching forward, it's unbalanced and awkward. Seriously, try running like this and feel how wrong it is. If a limb is extended out back during a dashing motion, you'd want to balance this leg being extended with the arm on the opposite end reaching forward or out instead. This isn't an absolute rule, however, and in some cases you can outstretch same-side limbs to accentuate directional motion. You can even get some decent forward movement poses balancing on one leg if you counterbalance properly, as well as some incredibly dynamic low shooting stances. What is this, equilibrium? If you really want to get into some crazy poses, definitely invest in getting bases for your kits. We could make a whole video series on the pros and cons of each action base, but we've been really digging the latest of Bandai's iterations, the 6 and the 7, as well as the simple stands. Simple stands and 6 are more meant for smaller models, on the scale of HGs and robot spirits. You really get your money's worth for them, since the 6 come 2 per pack and the simple stands come with 3. The action-based 7, on the other hand, is also primarily meant for larger HGs, figure-eyes, 30-minute missions, and real grades, but with the right adapters, they can properly support some 1/100s and master grades as well. Action bases 1 and 4 are still solid choices for larger kits though. Whichever base you end up choosing, the same kind of principle of balance applies. Another good concept to keep in mind, especially with dynamic poses, is the action line. There's always a sort of flow in a good pose, and it's especially noticeable in non-grounded poses where you can really let loose with your imagination. Looking at any dynamic pose, you can clearly see a good balance of movement going from a central point, some jagged, some straight out, some in a flowing curve. Don't ever be afraid to exaggerate as well. Some poses may not look at all useful or practical in a real combat scenario, but in all honesty, realism got thrown out the window once we started talking about giant robots in space that probably cost the GDP of several countries in a trench coat. Keep in mind the kind of scene you want to convey. A good chunk of mobile suits were designed with specific roles in mind, so you wouldn't see a ground type doing sick aerial poses. Once you understand the mission, you can keep it tame or go crazy. Gunpla is freedom and all that jazz. Just be sure to keep practicality in mind. One good thing to note while posing, be absolutely careful with all of your moving parts and joints. The absolute safest way to pose anything is to work your way outwards from the central body. For example, starting out with the shoulders, out to the elbow, all the way to the wrist and fingers. This will ultimately minimize the strain on all points of articulation and vastly reduce the risk of breakage. I've also found that articulating the joints this way helps you get a better understanding of how to make poses look a lot less stiff. Since you're micro-adjusting at each articulation point, it can help you achieve a more natural look. One of my favorite ways to practice posing is something you've all seen in our fast forward and rewind end cards. We like to take iconic poses from other shows and video games and do our absolute best to emulate them. It's pretty rare you'll get it 1-to-1 with how limited some of the joints on these kits are, but it's a great way to figure out the limitations of your kit, and having that kind of information in your head can really help you with posing moving forward. The first rule of figure and toy photography: turn off your flash. Flash may be useful in a lot of cases, but with figures and models, it'll mostly just drown out your subject and reflect off the surfaces horribly. Daylight bulbs, cool white or neutral LEDs, or even natural sunlight are your friend. Having manual control of your lighting will give you more options in how you want your photos to come out. Just make sure you also properly diffuse them to soften the effect on the subject and their shadows. Another very important factor for photography is the backdrop. Sometimes a quick photo on your desk is fine, but I've definitely been called out back in the day for a lot of what I leave laying around my desk. Just be mindful of your space. Some people opt to get light boxes, which are often decently priced and come with lights that get properly diffused, but the main issue with these is space. So our favorite space and budget-friendly option is A sheet of construction paper. This is genuinely pretty much a scaled down version of what you'd find in a lot of modeling studios in the first place. We decided to go with a sheet of white here instead of the black so the red wouldn't look too intense. You definitely want more space between the subject and background than I have here though. Distance helps the light travel and bounce off the background and can reduce shadows. Get your lighting of choice on it, ideally from the sides to avoid getting your own shadows in shot, and you can get some pretty decent photos. What can make or break your shots too, even just standard factory fresh poses, is composition. Now, I'm no art or photography major, but you can very much see the vast difference in a head-on shot like this, and something like this. The way to get a shot like this is to shoot from a low angle, making sure your camera is as low to the ground or table as possible and angling upwards. I love getting shots like this because it adds a good sense of scale to the subject. It's as if Bandai heard my wishes and built a 1-to-1 scale Jesta. Just take a look at how a lot of your favorite key arts are framed, even video game posters or just straight up Gunpla box arts, and you can kind of get an idea of what looks good and what doesn't. Pay attention to what you want to show off in your photos. A trick I've seen in more modern phones is that if you can't quite get something to focus up close with your camera, more often than not, zooming into a focus part can actually solve the issue. Another trick is to take a step back and to kind of gauge the overall shape of the silhouette of your pose. This goes hand in hand with the action lines that I mentioned earlier. Here, we have a sort of arrowhead created by the Testament lunging. Balancing the limbs, like this extended arm and wing, countered by this outstretched back leg, and then crunching some of them, like this bent forward knee, tucked rear arm, and a crunched torso, turned slightly away, can really help you create a sense of weight and direction in your shots. A good example of this is this back-boosting bazooka shot. The triangular silhouette made by the Stein's legs tapering up to the back end of the bazooka, with the shoulders flared up to stick out less, coupled with the center point being the barrel, kind of draws your eyes to all the right areas. We hope at least one of these tips can help you take some good shots of your models. And of course, this is not to say that any of this is necessary at all, but if you've ever really wanted to add some extra flair to your models on display, we truly hope this video has been of some help. If there's anything you'd like us to expand on, or if you'd like us to further break down any of the poses that you've seen here, let us know. Feel free to tag us on our socials as well if you've got a shot you're particularly proud of. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.